Hello. You're resting with Science Blanket, where we find wonder in the quiet. Tonight, we're wrapping ourselves in the hidden science of fairy tales. These aren't just stories. They are the ancient maps of the human mind, reflecting our deep biology, our evolutionary fears of the dark woods, and the soft chemistry of our imagination. Imagine a library where the books are made of starlight and the floors are lined with soft, green moss. You don't need to find the moral of the story or solve the riddle tonight. Just let the folklore tuck you in. If this blanket of myth helps you rest, please subscribe to keep the stories flowing for every sleepy soul in our community. Take a slow, deep breath. Feel your muscles go limp. Let your thoughts drift like leaves on a stream, and surrender to the stillness of the room. Your story for the day is over, and it's time for sleep to begin. Let's explore the magic and logic of fairy tales together. There's something almost magical about the way a child's mind works when they hear a story for the very first time. Perhaps you remember it yourself, that feeling of being transported somewhere else entirely, where anything could happen and often did. What we're only beginning to understand now is that this experience isn't just entertainment. It's actually reshaping the architecture of a developing brain in ways both profound and measurable. When a young child settles in to hear a fairy tale, something remarkable begins to happen beneath the surface of consciousness, a cascade of neural activity that scientists can now observe and document with extraordinary precision. Consider for a moment how fairy tales are constructed. They follow patterns that repeat themselves, rhythms that echo through the narrative like waves lapping at a shore. A hero faces 3 challenges. A question is asked 3 times. A magical phrase is spoken again and again. This isn't accidental, and it isn't merely tradition. These repetitive patterns serve as scaffolding for a child's developing mind, creating predictable structures that allow young listeners to practice something fundamental, the ability to anticipate what comes next. When a child hears that a character must complete 3 tasks, they begin to understand narrative logic, the way stories unfold according to certain rules and sequences. They're learning to predict outcomes, to follow the thread of cause and effect, to understand that actions have consequences and that events connect to one another in meaningful ways. The rhythm itself matters too, perhaps more than we realized for centuries. When stories employ repetition, when phrases recur and patterns emerge, something happens in the listener's mind. Concentration deepens. The ability to recall specific details, particular characters, precise plot points, all of this strengthens with each familiar echo in the narrative. A child hearing about the 3 little pigs doesn't just remember that there were pigs and a wolf. They remember which pig built which house, and in what order the wolf visited them, and exactly what he said each time. The repetition creates hooks for memory to grab onto, anchors in the stream of information flowing past. Researchers have analyzed the emotional content of fairy tales with modern computational tools, and they've discovered something fascinating. More than half of all the sentences in these ancient stories carry emotional weight. Joy, fear, sadness, triumph, despair, wonder. The sentiment trajectories vary wildly from tale to tale. Some stories begin in sorrow and climb toward happiness. Others start in comfort and plunge into danger before emerging into light again. This emotional variety isn't random noise. It's teaching children that feelings change, that emotions follow arcs, that darkness can give way to dawn. Each story becomes a safe space to experience and process complex emotional journeys. But here's where something curious enters the picture. Fairy tales are filled with events that simply cannot happen according to the laws that govern our physical universe. A frog transforms into a prince in an instant. A pumpkin becomes a coach in the blink of an eye. These transformations are central to the magic of fairy tales, and yet they contradict everything we know about biology. Real transformation, real growth, requires time. It requires enzymes to catalyze reactions, cells to divide and differentiate, proteins to fold into new configurations. The biological processes that underlie any real change in living tissue are slow, methodical, dependent on countless molecular interactions occurring in precise sequence. A tadpole becoming a frog takes weeks. A caterpillar becoming a butterfly requires the creature to essentially dissolve itself and reassemble. But in fairy tales, change is instantaneous, accomplished with a word or a kiss or a stroke of midnight. And it's not just living things that behave impossibly in these stories. Inanimate objects come alive with alarming regularity. Mirrors speak. Candlesticks dance. Teapots have opinions and personalities. This is enchanting, certainly, but it violates fundamental principles of physics. Consciousness, as far as we understand it, requires neural structures, networks of neurons capable of processing information and generating subjective experience. Non-living matter, lacking any such biological machinery, simply cannot possess awareness or intention. A mirror is glass and metal, molecules arranged in particular configurations that reflect light. It has no neurons, no brain, no substrate for thought. Yet in fairy tales, such objects are as alive as any character, and children accept this with ease because the story creates its own internal logic, its own rules about what is possible. The same impossibility applies to the magic potions that bubble and transform throughout these tales. A witch brews something that turns a person invisible, or makes them fall in love, or grants them eternal youth. But chemistry doesn't work this way. Real chemical changes require molecular reactions to occur, bonds to break and form, catalysts to speed processes along, equilibrium states to be reached as substances interact. You cannot simply mix ingredients and expect targeted, intentional outcomes without understanding the underlying chemistry. The molecular dance that creates new substances is governed by strict rules about energy, structure, and probability. Magic potions ignore all of this, producing effects that would require impossible precision at the molecular level, changes that chemistry as we know it cannot produce. And yet, despite all these impossibilities, or perhaps because of them, fairy tales do something genuinely remarkable to the developing brain. When children listen to these stories, they must hold multiple pieces of information in their minds simultaneously. They need to remember who the characters are, where they are, what has happened so far, what might happen next. This constant mental juggling strengthens working memory, that crucial cognitive function that allows us to manipulate and use information in real time. Attention itself becomes more focused and sustained. Following a narrative over time, especially one with twists and complications and multiple characters, is genuine mental work. It builds the very capacity for sustained attention that children will need for every intellectual task they encounter later in life. Scientists using neuroimaging technology can now watch what happens in the brain during story listening, and what they see is fascinating. When children hear narrative passages, when they engage with fairy tales and stories, specific brain regions light up with activity. Language processing areas activate, naturally, as the brain works to decode meaning from the stream of words. But something else happens too. The default mode network engages that constellation of brain regions that becomes active when we're making sense of the world, when we're constructing meaning, when we're thinking about the minds of others and imagining scenarios beyond the immediate present. Stories aren't just linguistic exercises. They're meaning-making machines, engaging the very networks that help us understand ourselves and others. Using a technique called near-infrared spectroscopy, researchers have peered into children's brains as stories unfold, and they've observed increased activity in the prefrontal cortex, that region at the front of the brain associated with complex thinking, planning, and imagination. As the narrative progresses, as children mentally construct the world the story describes and imagine what the characters might do next, this crucial brain region shows enhanced activity. Vocabulary expands in real time as new words appear in context, their meanings inferred from the flow of the story. Imagination stretches and strengthens like a muscle being exercised. Perhaps most remarkably, functional magnetic resonance imaging has revealed something that sounds almost like science fiction itself. When people listen to immersive narratives together, their brains begin to synchronize. Neural activity patterns in one listener's brain start to mirror those in another listener's brain. It's as though the story creates a shared mental space, a common landscape that multiple minds inhabit simultaneously. This neural synchronization means that listeners are constructing similar mental representations of the story world, imagining similar scenes, tracking similar emotional arcs, building similar understandings of character and motivation. The story becomes a shared experience at the most fundamental neural level, connecting minds in ways that transcend the physical separation between bodies. So we find ourselves in an interesting position. Fairy tales violate the laws of physics, chemistry, and biology with cheerful abandon. They present worlds where the impossible happens routinely, where transformation is instantaneous and objects possess consciousness and potions accomplish the chemically absurd. And yet these same impossible stories are profoundly real in their effects on developing minds. They strengthen memory and attention. They activate language networks and meaning-making systems. They enhance imagination and build vocabulary. They create neural synchronization between listeners, forging connections that make story hearing a fundamentally social and shared experience. The magic in fairy tales may be fictional, but the magic they work on the brain is measurably, documentably real. Perhaps that's the deepest truth hidden in these ancient stories, that fiction and reality are not opposites but partners, each illuminating something essential about what it means to be human, to learn, to grow, to imagine worlds beyond the one we can touch. The brain doesn't treat all stories equally. This might seem obvious in a general sense. We all know that a thrilling adventure feels different from a dry textbook, but neuroscience has revealed that the difference goes much deeper than subjective feeling. When researchers examine what happens in the brain during reading, they find that fairy tales activate neural networks in patterns distinctly different from other types of text. Specifically, when people read fairy tales, there's heightened activity in the posterior regions of the default mode network, those areas toward the back of the brain that become especially active during tasks involving memory retrieval, mental imagery, and the construction of complex scenarios. Reading expository text, the straightforward presentation of facts and information, activates the brain differently. Fairy tales seem to demand more from these deeper narrative processing regions, pulling the reader into a more immersive imaginative state. As reading expertise develops, something interesting happens with the brain's communication networks. The frontoparietal network, involved in attention and cognitive control, begins to work more closely with the default mode network when processing narratives like fairy tales. This functional connectivity, the coordinated activity between different brain regions, increases specifically for this type of story-driven content. It's as though the brain learns to orchestrate different systems more efficiently when dealing with narrative complexity. The attention networks and the imagination networks learn to dance together, creating a smooth cognitive experience where focus and creativity support one another. This doesn't happen to the same degree with non-narrative text. There's something about the structure of fairy tales, their blend of familiar patterns and impossible events, that trains these networks to collaborate. Children's eyes tell their own story about how they engage with fairy tales. When researchers track where young readers look and how long their gaze lingers, they discover that magical elements capture and hold attention in distinctive ways. A child reading about an ordinary house might glance at the words and move on quickly, but when that house is made of gingerbread or when it stands on chicken legs and walks through the forest, the eyes pause. The fixation time increases. This isn't distraction, it's deep engagement. The visual attention system is working harder, processing the unusual, the impossible, the wonderful. These extended fixations suggest that the child's mind is doing extra work, constructing mental images of things that have no counterpart in everyday experience, building internal representations of impossibility. The way children process fairy tales differs fundamentally from how they process expository text, and studies across different genres have mapped these differences with increasing precision. When reading or hearing factual information, children engage in more straightforward comprehension strategies, extracting information, categorizing it, storing it. But with fairy tales, something more elaborate unfolds. Children make narrative inferences, filling in gaps that the story doesn't explicitly state. They engage in world-building, constructing in their minds the rules that govern this particular fictional universe. If a fairy godmother can turn a pumpkin into a coach, what else might be possible in this world? What are the limits? Children intuitively work out these internal logics, creating coherent fictional frameworks even when those frameworks contradict physical reality. This raises an important question that has occupied developmental psychologists for generations. Does immersion in impossible scenarios confuse children about what's real? The evidence suggests something more sophisticated is happening. Fairy tales actually help children learn to distinguish fantasy from reality precisely because they're so clearly marked as special, as different, as belonging to a realm of story rather than everyday life. The formulas that begin these tales, once upon a time, in a faraway kingdom, signal to even young listeners that we're entering a different kind of space where different rules apply. Children can explore impossible scenarios, experiment with magical thinking, immerse themselves in worlds where transformation happens instantly and animals speak, all while developing the crucial cognitive ability to sort fantasy from fact. The stories become safe laboratories for understanding the difference between what can happen and what we can imagine happening. The benefits of regular engagement with fairy tales extend well beyond a single listening session or reading experience. Surveys that track children's reading habits over time, combined with experiments that test comprehension abilities, reveal a consistent pattern. Children who regularly encounter fairy tales develop stronger narrative comprehension skills in early childhood. They become better at understanding stories in general, at tracking plot developments, at understanding character motivations, at predicting outcomes. The skills practiced in one fairy tale transfer to the next story, and then to other narratives they encounter in books, in films, in conversations. Narrative comprehension becomes a general cognitive strength, a lens through which they interpret not just stories but the social world itself, because human life is largely understood through narrative, through the stories we tell about ourselves and others. When researchers step back and look at the full picture, drawing on insights from psychology, neuroscience, education, and sociology, they arrive at a remarkable conclusion. Fairy tales don't just influence one aspect of development. They touch multiple domains simultaneously, creating ripples across the entire landscape of a child's growth. Cognitive development accelerates as memory, attention, and imagination strengthen. Emotional development progresses as children experience and process complex feelings through story. Social development advances as children learn about relationships, cooperation, conflict, and resolution through character interactions. Moral development unfolds as tales present dilemmas and consequences, heroes and villains, choices and their outcomes. Few educational tools operate across so many dimensions at once. Most interventions target specific skills or specific domains. Fairy tales, almost accidentally, engage the whole developing person. Creativity itself seems to flourish in the soil of fairy tale exposure. Controlled studies, where researchers carefully compare children who hear fairy tales regularly with those who don't, report measurable differences in creative output and imaginative problem-solving. When presented with open-ended challenges, when asked to generate novel solutions or create original stories, children familiar with fairy tales perform differently. They propose more unusual solutions. They combine elements in unexpected ways. They're more willing to consider possibilities that violate conventional expectations. This makes intuitive sense when you consider what fairy tales model. They present problems that cannot be solved through ordinary means. A tower too tall to climb, a curse that cannot be broken by normal methods, a task that seems impossible. And then they show characters finding solutions through creativity, through magic, through unexpected alliances and unconventional approaches. Children absorb this pattern, this willingness to think beyond the obvious. The connection between fairy tales and executive function represents one of the more surprising findings in recent developmental research. Executive functions are the cognitive control processes that allow us to plan ahead, inhibit impulses, switch flexibly between tasks, and work toward distant goals. These are not skills we typically associate with fantastical stories about magic beans and enchanted forests. Yet research links fairy tale engagement, both reading and role-play, with growth in these practical cognitive abilities. Perhaps it's because following a fairy tale requires sustained attention and memory, both components of executive function. Perhaps it's because role-playing characters requires impulse control, staying in character, following the story's logic rather than doing whatever you feel like in the moment. Perhaps it's because fairy tales often involve characters who must plan, who must think several steps ahead, who must control their impulses to achieve their goals. Children watching or hearing or reenacting these stories practice these same cognitive skills. There's a deeper function that fairy tales serve, one that philosophers and psychologists have pointed to, but that's harder to measure with brain scans or behavioral tests. Fairy tales embody what we might call anticipatory knowledge. They allow children to simulate future scenarios, to mentally rehearse situations they haven't encountered yet in real life. The wicked stepmother, the dangerous stranger in the woods, the friend who betrays you, the moment when you must be brave despite your fear, these archetypal situations appear again and again in fairy tales, giving children a kind of preview of emotional and social challenges they may face. The stories don't provide simple answers or foolproof solutions, but they do provide frameworks for thinking about difficulty, for understanding that challenges can be overcome, that help sometimes comes from unexpected places, that cleverness and courage matter. When a real challenge arrives in a child's life, some part of their mind may recognize it as similar to something they've encountered in a story, and that recognition brings with it the implicit knowledge that such situations can be navigated, that there are paths through difficulty. So fairy tales exist in a curious space, rejected by the laws of physics and chemistry and biology, yet embraced by the developing brain as powerful tools for growth. They are impossible and yet invaluable, fictional and yet functionally real in their effects. The brain doesn't seem to mind the impossibility. In fact, it may be precisely the impossible nature of these tales that makes them so effective, because they force the mind to work harder, to construct realities that don't exist, to imagine beyond the boundaries of the everyday. In doing so, they strengthen the very capacities that make us human, the ability to think symbolically, to understand narrative, to simulate scenarios, to feel with fictional others, to distinguish fantasy from reality while still valuing both. Every time a child hears that once upon a time, neural networks activate, connections strengthen, and development unfolds in ways both measurable and mysterious, grounded in biology yet reaching towards something that feels like magic. When a child hears about a character who feels scared, or angry, or desperately sad, something important is happening beyond the surface of the story. The child is learning the vocabulary of inner life, the words and concepts that make feelings legible and communicable. This is what psychologists call emotional literacy, the ability to recognize what you're feeling, to name it accurately, to understand its nuances, and to talk about it with others. Fairy tales support this development in ways that direct instruction often cannot, because they present emotions in symbolic form, embodied in characters and situations that feel safely distant from the child's own life. A child might find it difficult to admit feeling jealous of a sibling, but hearing about a character consumed by envy creates space to explore that feeling without the weight of personal shame. The emotion exists in the story, where it can be examined, discussed, understood. The symbolic distance makes the emotional closeness possible. The developmental conflicts that children navigate as they grow are not simple or easy. Separation from parents, the complicated mix of love and rivalry with siblings, the fear of being abandoned or unloved, these are profound psychological challenges that every child faces in some form. Fairy tales, psychologists have observed, offer frameworks for working through these conflicts. Stories about children lost in forests and finding their way home speak to separation anxiety. Tales of siblings competing for limited resources, whether a parent's love or a share of an inheritance, mirror the real tensions in families. Wicked stepmothers and absent fathers, however exaggerated, reflect children's fears about parental love being withdrawn or insufficient. The stories don't resolve these conflicts with simple answers, but they acknowledge them, give them shape, and show characters navigating similar difficulties. This acknowledgement alone can be profoundly comforting. The child learns that these feelings are universal enough to appear in stories told for centuries, that they're part of the human experience rather than personal failures. Some approaches to understanding fairy tales go even deeper into psychological territory. Psychoanalytic interpretations, following in the tradition established by thinkers like Sigmund Freud and later extended by Bruno Bettelheim, read fairy tale figures and events as symbolic expressions of unconscious wishes and conflicts. The enchanted forest becomes the unconscious mind itself, dark and full of dangers but also possibilities. The transformation of beast into prince symbolizes the integration of animal instincts with civilized self-control. The jealous witch or evil queen represents the dark side of maternal power. Whether one accepts these specific interpretations or not, the underlying insight holds value. Fairy tales do seem to operate at a level beneath rational, everyday thinking. They touch something pre-rational, something that speaks in symbols and archetypes rather than logical arguments. From a different psychological tradition, Jungian psychology treats fairy tales as maps of what Carl Jung called the collective unconscious, that layer of psyche that all humans supposedly share, populated by universal patterns and images. In this view, fairy tales aren't just individual fantasies but expressions of archetypal patterns that recur across cultures and throughout history. The wise old woman, the trickster, the hero's journey, the death and rebirth. These patterns appear in fairy tales from traditions that had no contact with one another, suggesting they emerge from something deeper than cultural exchange. Whether you interpret this as evidence of a literal collective unconscious or simply as common patterns arising from common human experiences and needs, the observation itself is striking. Fairy tales do seem to touch universal chords, to resonate across vast differences in culture and time. The psychological power of fairy tales hasn't remained in the realm of theory. Clinicians and educators have developed therapeutic applications, using fairy tales deliberately to support children dealing with anxiety, trauma, or illness. These therapeutic fairy tales are carefully crafted or selected to mirror a child's situation in symbolic form, allowing them to process difficult experiences at a safe remove. A child facing medical procedures might hear stories about heroes who must undergo trials to emerge stronger. A child dealing with loss might encounter tales of transformation and renewal. The symbolic nature of the stories allows children to engage with painful realities without being overwhelmed by them. The emotions become manageable when they're happening to a character in a story, and the insights gain transfer back to the child's own experience. The applications extend beyond childhood. Research on positive narrative group therapy has documented how fairy tales can support psychological well-being in adults. In one study involving women participants, engagement with fairy tales through group discussion and reflection led to measurable increases in self-acceptance and life appreciation. The stories provided frameworks for reinterpreting personal narratives, for seeing patterns in their own lives, for recognizing themselves in archetypal journeys. The symbolic richness of fairy tales apparently continues to offer psychological resources throughout life, not just in childhood but whenever we need to make sense of difficulty, transition, or transformation. For children who have experienced trauma, fairy tale-based interventions have shown remarkable effectiveness. Fairy tale dramatization therapy, where children act out fairy tales in therapeutic settings, has been documented to reduce symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder by 30% in some child trauma cases. This is a substantial clinical outcome, comparable to or exceeding some pharmaceutical interventions. The mechanism seems to involve symbolic reenactment. By taking on roles in fairy tales, by acting out scenarios of danger and rescue, threat and resolution, children process their own traumatic experiences indirectly. They gain a sense of agency and control in the safe container of the story. They practice moving from victim to survivor to hero. The symbolic distance protects them from being re-traumatized, while the emotional truth of the story provides a pathway for processing what they've endured. Even in everyday educational settings, fairy tales demonstrate practical benefits for social and emotional development. Storytelling and story acting activities, where preschoolers listen to fairy tales and then dramatize them, enhance social skills in measurable ways. Teamwork improves as children collaborate to bring a story to life. Self-regulation strengthens as children learn to wait their turn, to stay in character, to follow the narrative rather than their immediate impulses. These are foundational social competencies that extend far beyond the classroom. Children who can cooperate with others, who can manage their own behavior in social contexts, navigate school and friendships more successfully. There's another profound capacity that fairy tales cultivate, one that's essential for social life. Cognitive empathy, the ability to understand and take the perspective of another person, develops through many pathways, but engagement with narrative is one of the most powerful. When children follow the experiences of fairy tale characters, they practice seeing the world through eyes other than their own. They understand what the character wants, what the character fears, why the character makes particular choices. This mental exercise, repeated across many stories and many characters, builds the neural and cognitive infrastructure for empathy. Children learn that other minds work differently from their own, that others have internal experiences and motivations that may not be immediately visible. This understanding forms the foundation for moral behavior and successful social relationships. You cannot truly cooperate with others or care about their well-being without first being able to imagine what their experience is like. The context in which fairy tales are shared matters as much as the tales themselves. When families engage in shared interactive reading of fairy tales at home, multiple benefits accrue simultaneously. Language development proceeds through exposure to rich vocabulary and complex sentence structures. But something else happens too, something less easily measured but perhaps equally important. The attachment between parent and child strengthens through these shared experiences. The ritual of story time creates a predictable space of closeness and safety. The child associates the parent's voice and presence with comfort and wonder. The parent gains insight into the child's inner world through their questions and reactions to the story. These moments of connection, repeated night after night, build the secure attachment that children need to explore the world confidently. The fairy tale becomes a bridge between parent and child, a shared imaginative space they inhabit together. So fairy tales operate on multiple levels simultaneously. They're entertainment, certainly, engaging and memorable stories that have survived because they're good at capturing attention. But they're also psychological tools, frameworks for understanding emotion, templates for working through conflict, symbolic languages for processing the difficult and the frightening. They build practical skills like empathy and self-regulation. They support therapeutic healing in clinical contexts and everyday emotional development in families. They speak to something deep in the human psyche, whether we call that the unconscious mind, the collective unconscious, or simply the part of us that thinks in symbols and images rather than words and logic. The impossible events in fairy tales, the magic and transformation and talking animals, aren't obstacles to their psychological usefulness. They're essential features, because it's precisely the symbolic, non-literal nature of these stories that allows them to touch the deepest layers of emotional and psychological life, the places where we don't think in facts and logic but in feelings, images, and stories about what it means to be human. Deep within the brain, in a region called the temporoparietal junction where the temporal and parietal lobes meet, something remarkable happens when children engage with fairy tales. This area, which sits roughly behind and above the ear on both sides of the brain, plays a crucial role in what psychologists call theory of mind, the ability to understand that other people have thoughts, beliefs, desires, and intentions that differ from your own. When children listen to fairy tales, neuroimaging reveals activation in this region as they work to understand why characters make the choices they do. Why does the youngest son share his bread with the old woman while his brothers refuse? What does the witch want, and why does she help sometimes and harm other times? These questions require children to construct mental models of other minds, to infer intentions from actions, to understand that behavior flows from internal mental states. Each fairy tale becomes an exercise in reading minds, and the temporoparietal junction strengthens its networks with each story, building the neural infrastructure for social understanding. Related to this, but operating through different neural mechanisms, is the activation of mirror neurons during fairy tale engagement. Mirror neurons fire both when we perform an action ourselves and when we observe someone else performing that action. They're part of the brain system for understanding others by internally simulating their experiences. When children engage deeply with fairy tale characters, when they mentally place themselves in the character's situation, mirror neuron systems activate. The child hearing about a character's fear or joy doesn't just intellectually understand these emotions, their brain mirrors them, creating a visceral, embodied form of understanding. This is empathy at the neural level, the brain's capacity to resonate with the emotional states of others. Fairy tales, by presenting vivid emotional scenarios and encouraging identification with characters, provide repeated practice for these empathy systems. The measurable outcomes of fairy tale exposure on empathy are striking. Studies comparing children who regularly engage with fairy tales to those who primarily encounter modern stories have documented differences in empathy levels of around 15%. This is not a trivial difference. A 15% increase in empathy could mean the difference between a child who notices when a classmate is upset and one who doesn't, between a child who offers help and one who walks past. Modern stories certainly have value, but there may be something about the structure and content of traditional fairy tales, their archetypal characters, their clear moral stakes, their symbolic distance that allows for safe emotional engagement, that makes them particularly effective vehicles for empathy development. The heightened emotions, the clear delineation between suffering and relief, the vivid consequences of actions, all of these may contribute to fairy tales' particular power to build empathetic capacity. Empathy alone doesn't guarantee pro-social behavior, but it's a crucial component. Fairy tales go further by explicitly modeling reciprocity, the fundamental social principle that kindness should be returned, that help given will be help received. Over and over, fairy tales show characters who share their last piece of bread rewarded, while those who hoard are punished. Characters who help others in need later receive help themselves. This isn't subtle moralizing, it's the structure of the narrative itself. Experimental research has tested whether this modeling translates to actual behavior, and the results suggest it does. Children who have been exposed to fairy tales show approximately 18% higher cooperation in subsequent tasks compared to control groups. They're more likely to share resources, to help others, to work collaboratively. The stories plant templates for social behavior that children then enact in their own interactions. The cognitive benefits of fairy tales extend into the realm of executive function, those higher-order thinking skills that allow us to control our impulses and flexibly shift our attention. Following a fairy tale requires inhibitory control. You must resist distractions and stay focused on the narrative thread. It also requires attention shifting, moving your focus from one character to another, from one scene to the next, from action to dialogue to description. For preschoolers, whose executive functions are still developing, this is genuine cognitive work. Regular engagement with fairy tales provides practice in these skills in a context that's engaging rather than tedious. The child wants to follow the story, so they willingly exercise the cognitive control necessary to do so. Over time, these capacities strengthen and generalize to other contexts where sustained attention and cognitive flexibility are needed. Language development, both at basic and advanced levels, receives powerful support from fairy tale reading, especially when it's repeated in the home environment. At the lower level, phonology, the sound structure of language, develops through hearing the rhythms and patterns of fairy tale language. The alliteration, the rhymes, the repeated phrases, all help children become attuned to how language sounds, which lays groundwork for reading. At higher levels, children absorb narrative structure itself, the grammar of storytelling, how events connect causally, how characters develop, how plots build to climaxes and resolve. They learn implicitly that stories have beginnings, middles, and ends, that events happen for reasons, that tension builds and releases. This understanding of narrative structure later supports their own storytelling and writing, their ability to organize experience into coherent accounts. The applications of fairy tales in educational and therapeutic settings continue to reveal new benefits. When fairy tale interventions are combined with play therapy in elementary school settings, researchers observe enhancements in creative thinking, both divergent thinking, the ability to generate many different ideas, and integrative thinking, the ability to combine ideas in novel ways. Children who engage with fairy tales through both hearing stories and playing with story elements become more flexible and original in their thinking. They propose more unusual solutions to problems. They make unexpected connections between ideas. The imaginative leaps that fairy tales model and encourage seem to transfer to creative thinking more broadly. Surprisingly, fairy tales have found a place even in early mathematics education. Digital ebooks presenting fairy tales have been used with kindergartners who struggle with early math concepts, and the results show improvements in mathematical vocabulary and early numeracy. How can a story about magic beans or enchanted frogs help with mathematics? The connection may lie in the narrative structure, providing a meaningful context for encountering numbers, quantities, sequences, and patterns. When math concepts are embedded in engaging stories rather than presented in isolation, children who struggle with abstract math may find a more accessible entry point. The story provides the scaffolding that makes the math comprehensible and memorable. For children learning multiple languages, fairy tales offer particular advantages. Wordless picture storybooks based on fairy tales, where the story is told entirely through images without text, have been shown to improve narrative language production in bilingual children. When children tell the story from the pictures, they practice organizing narrative, using diverse vocabulary, and creating coherent accounts. The fairy tale structure, even without words, provides a framework that guides their storytelling. Their lexical diversity increases as they search for words to describe the magical and unusual elements. Their narratives become more coherent as they follow the familiar fairy tale patterns of problem, journey, and resolution. The wordless format allows each child to tell the story in whichever language they choose, making fairy tales accessible across linguistic boundaries. In classrooms where English is being learned as a second language, fairy tales have proven remarkably effective pedagogical tools. They enhance vocabulary acquisition because they introduce words in memorable, emotionally charged contexts. They improve communication skills by providing models of dialogue and interaction. They strengthen listening comprehension because students want to understand what happens next in the story. They support literacy development across proficiency levels because the familiar structures and predictable patterns make even challenging text more accessible. A beginning English learner might not understand every word, but the structure of a fairy tale, its clear sequence and archetypal patterns, allows them to follow the story and build language skills in the process. Advanced learners encounter rich vocabulary and complex sentence structures that extend their capabilities. What emerges from all this research is a picture of fairy tales as remarkably versatile developmental tools. They're not designed for any single purpose, which may be exactly why they serve so many purposes well. They build neural networks for social understanding in the temporoparietal junction. They activate mirror neuron systems that enable empathy. They model prosocial behavior and reciprocity. They exercise executive functions like attention and cognitive control. They develop language at multiple levels simultaneously. They enhance creativity and even support mathematical and multilingual learning. No curriculum designer setting out to create a developmental intervention would think to combine all these elements, and yet fairy tales, emerging organically from oral tradition and refined over centuries of telling and retelling, somehow address this wide range of developmental needs. Perhaps this is because fairy tales evolved through a kind of natural selection. The stories that survived were the ones that deeply engaged children, and what deeply engages children turns out to be precisely what supports their cognitive, emotional, social, and linguistic development. The stories that stuck around were the ones that did important developmental work, even if the tellers didn't consciously understand all the mechanisms involved. The brain recognizes what it needs, and across cultures and centuries, it has returned again and again to these impossible tales of transformation and magic, finding in them something essential for growth. Language itself, with all its intricate grammar and structure, unfolds more naturally for children when it's embedded in compelling narrative. Fairy tales serve as particularly rich linguistic environments because they contain concentrated doses of language features that children need to master. Adjectives appear abundantly as narrators describe enchanted forests, beautiful princesses, wicked witches, brave heroes. Comparatives arise naturally in tales about the smallest brother who proves the cleverest, the oldest daughter who is less kind than the youngest, the fairest of them all. Past tenses dominate because stories recount events that have already happened, giving children repeated exposure to was, were, had been, would become. Through reading exercises with fairy tales, children encounter these grammatical structures not as isolated rules to memorize but as living elements of meaningful communication. The grammar becomes comprehensible because it's serving the story, and children acquire it almost incidentally while pursuing what they really want, which is to find out what happens next. When researchers design controlled studies comparing children who regularly read fairy tales with those who don't, the results consistently favor the fairy tale readers. Empirical data from matched cohorts, children similar in age, background, and initial ability, show that those with regular fairy tale exposure demonstrate language skills approximately 20% better than non-readers. This is a substantial advantage, the kind of difference that can affect academic success across many subjects, since language ability underpins almost all formal learning. Reading comprehension, writing quality, vocabulary size, grammatical sophistication, all these show measurable improvements in children who regularly engage with fairy tales. The stories act as language-rich environments where development can flourish. The benefits appear early and compound over time. Longitudinal studies, which follow the same children across months or years, reveal that preschoolers with regular fairy tale exposure develop phonological awareness about 25% faster than peers without such exposure. Phonological awareness, the understanding of how sounds work in language, is one of the strongest predictors of later reading success. Children who can hear that cat and hat rhyme, who can break stop into its component sounds, who can recognize that butterfly contains two smaller words, are positioned to become successful readers. Fairy tales, with their rhythmic language, their rhymes and alliterations, their repeated phrases, provide exactly the kind of auditory environment where phonological awareness develops naturally. The 25% acceleration in growth represents months of developmental advantage, a head start that often persists as children enter formal reading instruction. Not all reading activates the brain in the same ways, and the differences tell us something about what different texts demand cognitively. When children process expository texts, straightforward presentations of facts and information, neuroimaging shows strong activation in the frontoparietal control network, brain regions involved in directed attention and working memory. The child is working to extract and retain information, deploying cognitive control to stay focused on material that may not be intrinsically engaging. Fairy tale narrative comprehension shows a different pattern. The frontoparietal network activates less intensely because the narrative structure carries the child along, attention sustained by interest rather than effortful control. Instead, other networks engage more fully, regions involved in mental imagery, emotional processing, and social cognition. The brain is working hard during fairy tale reading, but it's different work, more integrative and imaginative, less controlled and extractive. One of the more remarkable findings from neuroscience research on narrative is how similarly different brains process the same story. Semantic brain maps, detailed charts of which brain regions respond to which concepts and meanings, show nearly identical patterns across individuals when they're reading or listening to the same narrative. Your brain processing "The Princess Climbed the Tower" activates regions in patterns very similar to another person's brain processing the same sentence. This is true whether the story is being read silently or heard aloud. The narrative creates a shared semantic landscape across minds. We're not just understanding the same words abstractly, our brains are constructing similar mental representations, activating similar patterns of neural activity. Stories synchronize minds at a deep neurological level, creating common ground for shared understanding and communication. The source of the story matters too, particularly for young children. Research comparing different reading contexts has found that fairy tale reading by mothers activates children's prefrontal areas, brain regions involved in complex thinking and self-regulation, more strongly than other types of reading. There's something about the combination of fairy tale content and maternal voice that creates optimal conditions for brain activation. Perhaps it's the emotional safety of the mother's presence combined with the engaging content of the fairy tale. Perhaps it's the mother's natural modulation of tone and pacing, unconsciously optimized through evolution and culture to capture and hold a child's attention. Whatever the mechanism, the mother-child fairy tale reading dyad appears to be a particularly powerful context for cognitive development, engaging the child's brain at deep levels. When computational linguists analyze fairy tales, treating the texts as data and measuring their linguistic properties objectively, they discover that fairy tales have significantly higher syntactic complexity than everyday speech. The sentence structures are more elaborate, with more embedded clauses, more sophisticated grammatical constructions, more varied sentence types. This complexity might seem like an obstacle, but it's actually an opportunity. Children hearing or reading these complex sentences are exposed to grammatical possibilities they rarely encounter in conversation. They hear how subordinate clauses work, how relative clauses modify nouns, how different verb tenses coordinate to show temporal relationships. This exposure, repeated across many tales, scaffolds grammar acquisition in ways that simplified language cannot. The child's grammatical competence expands to match the complexity they're encountering. Language comprehension itself is not a single, monolithic process but a collection of different mechanisms working together. Cluster analysis, a statistical technique for identifying patterns in complex data, has revealed that at least 3 distinct mechanisms are activated differently depending on whether someone is processing fairy tale narratives versus other types of text. One mechanism appears to specialize in tracking character states and mental attitudes. Another focuses on temporal sequencing, understanding when events happen relative to one another. A third handles causal relationships, determining why events occur and how they're connected. Fairy tales, with their clear character psychology, their careful temporal structuring through repeated patterns, and their explicit cause-effect relationships, activate all 3 mechanisms robustly. Other text types might engage some mechanisms more than others, but fairy tales seem to provide balanced exercise across the full range of comprehension systems. Beyond grammar and vocabulary, fairy tales teach something more subtle and perhaps more important for real social communication. Pragmatic analysis, which examines how language is used in context to accomplish social goals, reveals that fairy tales are rich in implicature and indirect speech acts, the ways we mean more than we literally say. When a character in a fairy tale asks, "Mirror, mirror, on the wall, who's the fairest of them all?" the literal question is about comparative beauty, but the implicature, what's really being communicated, involves vanity, insecurity, competition. When a wolf asks Little Red Riding Hood where she's going, the question seems innocuous, but context gives it sinister implications. Children learning to navigate these layers of meaning are developing pragmatic competence, the ability to understand what people really mean in social contexts, to read between the lines, to grasp the unspoken. This is essential for social discourse, where much of what's important is implied rather than stated explicitly. Fairy tales also build foundational cognitive abilities that extend well beyond language. The narratives constantly present cause-effect chains, events that happen because of previous events, characters whose decisions lead to consequences. Following these causal sequences exercises reasoning abilities. Why did this happen? What will happen as a result? Children naturally engage in this kind of analysis while following a story, predicting outcomes based on causes, understanding that actions have consequences. They also engage in critical analysis of character decisions. Was the character wise to trust the stranger? Should they have listened to the warning? Could they have chosen differently? These are evaluative judgments that require the child to consider alternatives, to weigh evidence, to think critically about choices and their outcomes. Every fairy tale becomes an exercise in reasoning and judgment, cognitive capacities that transfer to thinking about their own lives and the world around them. So fairy tales operate as comprehensive language and cognitive development tools, working at multiple levels simultaneously. They teach the surface features of language, the adjectives and verb tenses and syntactic structures. They build foundational skills like phonological awareness that make reading possible. They activate brain networks differently than expository text, engaging imagination and emotion alongside comprehension. They create shared semantic landscapes across minds, facilitating communication and mutual understanding. They expose children to linguistic complexity that stretches their grammatical competence. They exercise multiple comprehension mechanisms in balanced ways. They teach the pragmatic subtleties of real communication, the implications and indirect meanings that make social discourse work. And they build reasoning skills through constant engagement with causation and consequence, choice and outcome. No single aspect of this accounts for why fairy tales have persisted across centuries and cultures. It's the combination. The way these impossible stories about magic and transformation happen to provide exactly what developing minds need: language embedded in meaning, grammar woven into narrative, thinking skills practiced through engagement with compelling content. The tales endure because they work, because something in their structure resonates with the structure of developing minds, because the brain recognizes in them what it needs to grow. The human brain didn't evolve to memorize lists of disconnected facts. It evolved to make sense of experience, to find patterns in the flow of events, to understand the world through narrative. This is why neuroscience and education research consistently show that stories, particularly rich narratives like fairy tales, engage more brain regions and produce better attention than decontextualized fact lists. When you try to memorize isolated facts, you're activating primarily the hippocampus and related memory structures, working against the grain of how the brain naturally processes information. But when those same facts are embedded in a story, suddenly multiple brain systems engage. The language networks activate to process words and meanings. Emotional centers respond to the feelings the story evokes. Visual cortices construct mental imagery of scenes and characters. Motor areas simulate the actions being described. Social cognition networks track character intentions and relationships. All these different regions working together create a rich, multidimensional memory trace, a web of neural activation that's far easier to retrieve later than a single isolated fact stored in isolation. This leads us into fascinating territory explored by researchers studying embodied cognition, the idea that thinking isn't confined to abstract symbol manipulation in the brain but is deeply grounded in bodily experience and action. Fairy tales engage embodied cognition powerfully because they're full of physical actions and sensory details. Characters climb, run, taste, touch, see, hear. When we engage with these narratives, we don't just abstractly understand that a character is climbing a tower. Our motor cortex shows activation patterns similar to what would occur if we were actually climbing. Our visual system constructs the tower. Our proprioceptive sense imagines the muscle strain, the height, the danger. We think through our imagined bodies, extending our mental processes through these imagined physical interactions. The story becomes something we experience bodily, not just intellectually. Some scholars push this idea further, arguing that the material details in literary fairy tales, the specific objects and settings and sensory descriptions, function as extensions of mind itself. This draws on the extended mind hypothesis, a philosophical and cognitive science framework suggesting that thinking doesn't stop at the skull. Tools, technologies, even elements of our environment become part of our cognitive system when they reliably augment our thinking. In this view, the vivid details of fairy tales serve as cognitive scaffolding. The glass slipper, the spinning wheel, the enchanted mirror, these aren't just story elements but thinking tools. They give concrete form to abstract concepts. They provide handles for memory to grasp. They extend imagination beyond what our biological brains could generate unaided. The marvels in fairy tales, the magic beans that grow to the sky, the cloaks of invisibility, the animals that speak, these amplify human imagination, letting us think thoughts that would be impossible without these narrative tools to think with. Language itself changes its character in fairy tales. Normally, we think of words as symbols that represent things, carriers of meaning but separate from what they mean. But fairy tales sometimes make language performative, endowing words with power to enact changes. A spell spoken aloud transforms a prince into a frog. A promise made in words binds characters to fates they cannot escape. True names have power over things. This somaticizes language, gives it body and physical force. When children engage deeply with fairy tales, language takes on this quasi-physical quality. Words aren't just abstract tokens but forces that can change reality within the story world. This may seem like pure fantasy, and in a literal sense it is, but it also captures something true about how language works. Words do change reality. They create social facts, alter emotional states, reshape how we perceive and understand. Fairy tales literalize this power, making visible what's usually invisible about how language operates. The form in which fairy tales are presented affects how the brain processes them. Wordless picture storybooks, where the narrative unfolds through images alone, and animated fairy tales shown as films or videos, both alter functional brain connectivity compared to traditional read-aloud stories. Functional connectivity refers to how different brain regions coordinate their activity, which networks synchronize and communicate. Visual storytelling engages visual processing networks more intensely, naturally, but it also changes how narrative processing systems integrate information. Young children viewing wordless picture books must construct the narrative themselves from visual cues, which activates different executive and integrative processes than hearing a narrator's voice provide explicit narrative structure. Animated tales add motion and often music, engaging additional sensory and emotional systems. None of these formats is superior to others. They simply activate the neural networks differently, and exposure to multiple formats may provide the richest developmental environment. When fairy tales become interactive, when children can make choices that affect story progression, the cognitive engagement deepens in specific ways. Research on interactive fairy tale applications has shown improvements in memory recognition, particularly in girls with learning disabilities who often struggle with traditional academic tasks. The interactivity creates a sense of agency and investment. The child isn't just receiving a story but co-creating it through choices. This transforms the experience from passive reception to active problem-solving. Which path should the character take? Which magical object should they choose? Each decision point requires the child to hold in mind the story so far, predict possible outcomes, and evaluate options. This active engagement strengthens memory encoding. The story becomes personally meaningful because the child's choices shaped it, and this personal involvement creates stronger, more retrievable memories. Fairy tales have even found applications in cutting-edge virtual reality technology. VR simulations based on fairy tale narratives have been used with neurotypical youth to strengthen spatial memory and navigation skills. In these simulations, users don't just read or hear about enchanted forests and castle mazes, they navigate through them in immersive three-dimensional space. They must remember where they've been, create mental maps, navigate back to locations they visited earlier. The fairy tale provides the narrative motivation. You need to find your way back to the witch's cottage to break the curse. You must navigate the labyrinth to reach the treasure. The spatial navigation becomes purposeful, embedded in story, and this combination of narrative engagement and spatial challenge creates optimal conditions for developing spatial cognitive abilities. The brain's hippocampus, crucial for spatial memory, and the parietal regions involved in spatial reasoning, get intensive exercise in these fairy tale-based virtual worlds. The applications extend across the lifespan, even supporting cognitive health in older adults. Dual-task training protocols that combine physical exercise with cognitive challenge have shown promise for maintaining function in aging. One innovative approach uses fairy tales as the cognitive component. Older adults with mild cognitive impairment exercise while listening to fairy tales and answering questions about the narrative. The dual demand, moving the body while tracking a story, challenges multiple systems simultaneously. Results show improvements not just in memory and cognitive function but also in muscle strength. The fairy tale component appears crucial because it provides motivation and engagement that makes the exercise sustainable. Participants want to hear how the story ends, so they keep going. The narrative structure helps them track time and progress. And the cognitive work of following the story provides exactly the kind of mental challenge that supports brain health. For children with attention deficits, particularly those diagnosed with ADHD, fairy tales have been incorporated into neurofeedback training with remarkable results. Neurofeedback involves monitoring brain activity in real time and providing feedback to help individuals learn to regulate their own neural patterns. In fairy tale-based protocols, children wear sensors that monitor attention-related brain activity while they listen to stories. When their attention wanders, the story pauses or audio quality degrades. When they maintain focus, the story continues clearly. This immediate feedback, combined with the intrinsic motivation to follow an engaging narrative, helps children learn to sustain attention. The immersive quality of fairy tales, their ability to capture and hold interest, makes them ideal for this application. Children aren't trying to pay attention to boring stimuli as a pure exercise of will. They're drawn into a story world, and the neurofeedback helps them notice and correct when their minds drift. Over repeated sessions, attention deficits measurably improve. What emerges from all this research is a picture of fairy tales as remarkably flexible cognitive tools that can be adapted to diverse needs and enhanced through various media and technologies. They engage multiple brain systems in integrated ways that support learning and memory. They ground abstract thinking in embodied, physical-like experience. They extend imagination beyond biological limits through their marvels and impossibilities. They can be rendered in different formats, words or pictures or animation or virtual reality, each engaging the brain differently. They can be made interactive, deepening engagement and agency. They support cognitive development in young children, therapeutic intervention for those with learning differences or attention challenges, and cognitive maintenance in older adults. The narrative structure, the emotional engagement, the imaginative demand, all these features that made fairy tales successful as oral tradition turn out to make them equally successful as scaffolding for modern cognitive interventions and educational technologies. The stories are old, some of them ancient, but their usefulness continues to expand as we discover new ways to deploy them in service of human cognitive development and well-being across the entire lifespan. Medical settings are inherently stressful for children, and perhaps nowhere more so than in the moments before anesthesia, when a child is separated from parents and surrounded by unfamiliar equipment and masked faces. Clinicians searching for ways to reduce this anxiety have discovered something unexpected. Fairy tale videos, played for children during anesthesia induction measurably reduce stress responses. Heart rate stay calmer. Cortisol levels, the body's primary stress hormone, rise less dramatically. Children cry less and cooperate more. The fairy tale provides an anchor point for attention, a familiar narrative structure in an unfamiliar and frightening environment. The child's mind, given something engaging to focus on, doesn't spiral into panic. The story becomes a bridge between the safe world they know and this strange medical moment, making the transition gentler, the fear more manageable. The physiological effects of fairy tale engagement extend beyond immediate stress reduction. Hormonal assays, careful measurements of hormone levels in saliva or blood before and after fairy tale reading sessions, show consistent patterns. Cortisol levels drop, indicating reduced stress. Oxytocin levels rise, reflecting increased feelings of bonding and social connection. This hormonal profile is the opposite of what stress produces. Instead of the fight or flight response, fairy tale reading promotes what some researchers call the rest and digest state, or more poetically, the tend and befriend response. The body relaxes. Social bonds strengthen. When this happens in the context of parent-child reading, the oxytocin rise may be particularly significant, chemically reinforcing the attachment bond between caregiver and child. The story isn't just entertaining the child, it's literally changing their body chemistry in ways that promote well-being and connection. Some psychological theories see fairy tales as addressing the deepest and sometimes most uncomfortable aspects of human development. Freudian psychoanalytic research interprets many fairy tales as symbolic representations of sexual development stages and Oedipal dynamics. The Oedipus complex, in Freudian theory, involves the child's unconscious desire for the opposite-sex parent and rivalry with the same-sex parent. Fairy tales, in this reading, provide symbolic ways of working through these taboo feelings. The wicked stepmother represents the child's ambivalent feelings toward the mother who sometimes frustrates them. The absent or weak father in many tales reflects the child's wish to displace the father. The romantic unions at the end of tales symbolize the eventual resolution of these developmental conflicts and the child's movement toward appropriate adult relationships. Whether one accepts these specific interpretations or not, they point to something real. Fairy tales do seem to address psychological material that's too threatening or complex for direct discussion, providing symbolic containers for intense and confused feelings. From a different psychological tradition, Jungian analysis reads fairy tale elements, particularly animals, as anthropomorphic symbols that represent different aspects of the psyche. The helpful animal companions that appear in so many tales, the wise owl, the loyal dog, the clever fox, these aren't just plot devices but representations of instinctual wisdom, intuitive knowledge, aspects of self that exist outside conscious rational control. In Jungian terms, engaging with these animal figures helps with shadow integration, the process of acknowledging and incorporating the parts of ourselves we usually deny or repress. The wolf in fairy tales is dangerous but also powerful and free, representing aspects of our own nature we fear but also need. By encountering these symbolic animals in stories, children begin the lifelong work of individuation, becoming whole by integrating all aspects of self, not just the parts approved by society and consciousness. A question that has troubled some parents and educators is whether immersion in impossible scenarios confuses children about reality. The evidence suggests the opposite. Psychologists have documented that fairy tales actually help children distinguish fantasy from reality precisely because they're so clearly marked as belonging to a different category of experience. The opening formulas, "Once upon a time, in a land far away," signal that what follows operates under different rules. Children as young as 3 or 4 understand this distinction. They know that pumpkins don't really turn into coaches, but they can imaginatively engage with a world where they do. This ability to hold 2 frameworks simultaneously, this is real versus this is pretend, is a sophisticated cognitive achievement, and fairy tales provide a safe space to practice it. The impossible scenarios don't confuse children about reality. They help children understand that imagination is a separate domain with its own pleasures and uses. In recent decades, anthropologists have brought powerful new analytical tools to the study of fairy tales, tools borrowed from evolutionary biology. Phylogenetic methods, originally developed to reconstruct evolutionary relationships between species, can also trace how stories evolve and spread between cultures. Just as biologists compare DNA sequences to build family trees of organisms, anthropologists compare plot elements and character types to build family trees of stories. They can track how specific fairy tales evolved, which versions are older, which are derived from which, how stories changed as they moved from culture to culture. This has revealed that the origins of some fairy tales are far more ancient than anyone suspected. Comparative work examining fairy tale plots across Indo-European languages, that vast family of related languages stretching from India to Iceland, suggests that some stories may be thousands of years old, predating written literature by millennia. These weren't stories written down and preserved, they were oral narratives, passed from teller to teller, generation to generation, evolving slightly with each retelling but maintaining recognizable core structures. The fact that similar plot patterns appear in cultures separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years suggests they descend from common ancestral versions told by peoples who lived in prehistoric times. One massive phylogenetic analysis examined 275 fairy tales and reduced them to 76 basic plot types, distinct story skeletons that appear across multiple cultures. By mapping which cultures tell which variants and analyzing the relationships between versions, researchers traced some of these plots back through the branching tree of Indo-European languages to prehistoric origins. The methodology is sophisticated, using the same statistical tools that evolutionary biologists use to infer the history of life on Earth, but applied to cultural evolution, the history of stories instead of the history of species. The Cinderella story exemplifies how deep these roots can go. Cross-cultural phylogenetic analysis has mapped variants of the Cinderella tale, the mistreated girl who rises to recognition and happiness across dozens of cultures. The variants form a family tree that, when mapped onto what we know about Indo-European language divergence, suggests the core Cinderella plot may have originated roughly 5,000 years ago, in or near the Proto-Indo-European cultural complex. This was before writing, before recorded history, yet the story structure survived through pure oral transmission, adapting to each culture while maintaining its essential pattern. The girl, the oppression, the transformation, the recognition, the happy ending, these elements have been resonating with human audiences for 50 centuries. Similarly, Little Red Riding Hood, that tale of a girl, a wolf, and a dangerous journey through the woods, shows remarkable persistence and spread. Evolutionary biology techniques applied to oral traditions have identified variants of this story across 58 different cultural contexts. The story evolved, certainly. The details changed. In some versions she escapes through cleverness, in others she's rescued, in some darker versions the ending is tragic. But the core, a young person's dangerous encounter with predatory threat, remains recognizable across all the variations. The story must answer to something deep in human psychology, some fear or concern or developmental challenge that's been relevant across vast spans of time and space. What does it mean that some fairy tales are this old? It suggests they're not just entertainment, not just arbitrary narratives that happen to catch on. Stories that survive 5,000 years of retelling, that spread across continents through oral transmission alone, that adapt to vastly different cultures while maintaining their core structures. These stories must be doing something important. They must be addressing psychological needs or social functions that are fundamental to human experience, not tied to any particular culture or historical moment, but emerging from the shared facts of being human, having childhood, facing danger, experiencing transformation, seeking meaning. The impossible events in fairy tales, the magic and the talking animals and the instant transformations, these may be the surface features that make the stories engaging and memorable. But beneath them lie patterns, plot structures, character relationships, psychological dynamics that have proven relevant to humans across the entire span of Indo-European culture, from prehistoric steppe peoples to modern urban children listening before bed. The deep roots of fairy tales suggest deep roots in human nature itself, stories whose survival testifies to their continuing usefulness for the developing mind, for the social group, for making sense of a world that has always been, for children, both wondrous and dangerous, full of both possibility and threat. There are stories so old they predate empires, predate writing, predate cities themselves. One such tale is known as The Smith and the Devil, a story about a blacksmith who makes a bargain with a supernatural being and through cleverness gains an advantage. Variations of this tale appear across Europe and Asia, and phylogenetic analysis, the same evolutionary tree-building methods used to trace biological ancestry, has traced this particular story back to the Bronze Age, to Indo-European peoples who lived roughly 6,000 years ago. These were people who had just begun working with metal, for whom the smith was a figure of almost magical power, transforming rocks into tools through fire and skill. The story emerged in that world and somehow survived the rise and fall of countless civilizations, passed from generation to generation through nothing more than human memory and the urge to tell stories. When researchers build phylogenetic trees for fairy tales, comparing plot elements across cultures the way biologists compare genes across species, they discover something fascinating. The patterns of similarity don't correspond primarily to geographic proximity. Stories don't simply spread to neighboring peoples and stop. Instead, the distributions correlate with language family trees, with the deep ancestral relationships between languages. Tales cluster not by who lives near whom today, but by who descended from common ancestral cultures thousands of years ago. This suggests that fairy tales primarily spread through vertical inheritance, passed down through cultural lineages rather than horizontally between neighboring but unrelated groups. The stories traveled with peoples as they migrated and diversified. When a Proto-Indo-European group split into different daughter populations, each carried versions of the ancestral stories, which then evolved independently, accumulating changes but retaining recognizable core structures. This pattern, stronger phylogenetic than spatial association, tells us something about how culture transmits. It behaves more like biological inheritance than like diffusion. When populations split and migrate, they carry their stories with them, and those stories remain more similar to each other than to stories from geographically nearby but culturally unrelated groups. Cultural evolution models have formalized this insight, treating elements of culture, including fairy tales, as units that replicate and evolve much like genes do in biological evolution. The term for these cultural replicators is memes, coined by biologist Richard Dawkins long before the Internet gave the word a new meaning. In this technical sense, a meme is any unit of cultural information that passes from mind to mind through imitation or teaching. Fairy tale memetics applies this framework specifically to stories, positing that fairy tales are memes, replicating units that copy themselves from brain to brain, from culture to culture, evolving through variation and selection. A story is told, listeners remember it, they tell it to others with slight variations. Some versions prove more memorable or engaging and get retold more often, while others fade away. Over generations, this process shapes the stories, selecting for elements that stick in memory, that resonate emotionally, that serve useful psychological or social functions. The stories that survive to reach us today are the winners of this evolutionary process, tested and refined by thousands of years of cultural selection. The variations that made stories less memorable, less useful, less emotionally compelling, those were selected against and disappeared. The connections between fairy tale distribution and human population history go deeper still. Researchers comparing ancient DNA evidence, genetic signatures from prehistoric human remains, with fairy tale motif distributions have found suggestive correlations. Certain story elements appear in populations descended from common ancestral groups, tracking migration patterns revealed by genetics. When Indo-European peoples spread from their homeland, probably somewhere in the steppes north of the Black and Caspian Seas, they carried not just their languages and their genes but their stories. As these populations moved into Europe, into India, into Iran, their fairy tales moved with them, evolving in each new environment but retaining traces of common origin. The fairy tales co-evolved with the populations, another strand in the complex braid of culture, language, and genetics that makes up human history. Why would certain stories persist for so long? Evolutionary models suggest that fairy tales endure partly because they provide adaptive value, transmitting information that increase survival and reproductive success in ancestral environments. Many fairy tales encode cautions about real dangers. Don't talk to strangers in the forest. Don't trust appearances. Be wary of those who offer gifts or make promises that seem too good to be true. Little Red Riding Hood warns about predatory strangers. Hansel and Gretel reinforces the danger of trusting unfamiliar adults. Snow White teaches that poisoned food can come in beautiful packages. These aren't arbitrary plot devices but crystallizations of real survival wisdom. Children who internalized these cautions were slightly more likely to survive to adulthood and pass on the stories to their own children. The tales that encoded useful warnings were more likely to be told and retold, selected by the simple fact that they helped keep children alive. Interestingly, fairy tales themselves have become tools for teaching about evolution and natural selection. Educational research has shown that using fairy tales in science education for second and third graders helps young children grasp the basic concepts of natural selection. The stories provide frameworks that make abstract evolutionary principles concrete and comprehensible. A tale about animals competing for resources can illustrate natural selection. A story about how a character's traits help them survive can demonstrate adaptation. The narrative structure makes the science accessible to young minds not yet ready for formal biological terminology or mathematical models. The stories do what they've always done: transmit important information in memorable, engaging forms. Fairy tales have also found applications in STEM education, specifically in demonstrating why certain magical events are physically impossible, which paradoxically helps children understand real physical principles. Consider Rapunzel and her impossibly long hair. A STEM activity might ask students to apply physics laws, specifically understanding of gravity, weight, tensile strength, and the structural properties of human hair, to calculate whether Rapunzel's hair could actually support a person's weight. The answer, of course, is no. Human hair, no matter how long, would break long before it could bear the load of an adult human climbing it. The calculation teaches real physics, tensile strength, force, the material properties of biological structures, all while engaging with a familiar story. The impossibility becomes the teaching point. Chemistry education has similarly borrowed from fairy tales. Rumpelstiltskin spins straw into gold, one of the most famous transformations in all of folklore. Chemistry experiments inspired by this tale demonstrate why it's impossible, not because of magical constraints but because of atomic structure. Gold is an element with a specific atomic number, 79 protons in each nucleus. Straw is composed of complex organic molecules, primarily cellulose, containing carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. No chemical reaction can change one element into another. That would require nuclear reactions, adding or removing protons from atomic nuclei, something that doesn't happen in ordinary chemistry. The conservation of atomic structure is an iron law of chemistry. The experiment teaches students about elements, atomic structure, conservation laws, all while showing why a beloved fairy tale event violates the rules that govern our universe. These educational applications work because the impossible elements of fairy tales create what educators call productive cognitive conflict. The student knows the story, believes on some level in its internal logic, but then confronts the physical or chemical impossibility. This conflict creates curiosity, a desire to understand why reality works differently than story. The resolution of this conflict, learning the actual physical or chemical principles, becomes memorable precisely because it contradicted something the student initially accepted. The fairy tale provides the hook that makes the science lesson stick. So fairy tales exist in multiple time frames simultaneously. They're ancient, some stretching back thousands of years to Bronze Age and even prehistoric origins. They evolved through cultural transmission, shaped by the same kinds of selective pressures that shape biological evolution, optimized through countless retellings to be memorable, emotionally resonant, and socially useful. They co-evolved with human populations, traveling with migrations, diversifying with cultural divergence, maintaining deep connections to ancestral forms. They persist partly because they encode adaptive information, warnings, and wisdom that increase survival in ancestral environments and remain relevant today. And they continue to find new uses, teaching evolution to second graders, teaching physics through impossibility, teaching chemistry through magical transformations that violate conservation laws. The stories that began around Bronze Age fires, told by peoples who are now dust and whose languages have vanished, still speak to us, still teach us, still shape how children understand themselves and their world, proving their adaptive value not once but generation after generation across the full span of recorded and pre-recorded human history. The Candy House in Hansel and Gretel presents an irresistible fantasy, a dwelling made entirely of sweets, gingerbread walls, and frosting mortar and candy decorations. But what would actually happen to such a structure? Biology lessons built around this fairy tale explore the real processes that would quickly destroy a candy house. Microbial decomposition would begin almost immediately as bacteria and fungi colonized the sugar-rich surfaces, breaking down complex carbohydrates into simpler compounds. Insects would arrive, attracted by the concentrated sugars. Moisture from air and rain would dissolve structural elements, and the second law of thermodynamics, the principle of entropy, would drive the system inexorably toward disorder. The organized structure of the house would decay into a formless pile of decomposing organic matter. The lesson teaches microbiology, ecology, thermodynamics, all grounded in asking what would really happen to this fairy tale impossibility. The contrast between magical permanence and real decay makes the science memorable. This represents a broader educational strategy, using fairy tales to debunk misconceptions and prompt critical thinking about where real-world science sets boundaries. Rather than simply telling students what's impossible, educators invite them to investigate why, using the tools of scientific inquiry. The fairy tale provides the claim to be tested, the hypothesis to be evaluated. Students design experiments, gather evidence, apply scientific principles, and reach conclusions that explain why the magical event can't occur in reality. This process develops scientific thinking skills, the ability to question claims, demand evidence, apply logical reasoning, distinguish between what we imagine and what physical law permits. The fairy tale becomes the starting point for genuine scientific investigation. The communicative power of narrative has even been harnessed in unlikely contexts, such as Antarctic climate research. Scientists studying climate change in Antarctica face a challenge. Their data is crucial, their findings alarming, but the raw numbers and technical papers don't reach or move general audiences. Some researchers have experimented with what they call Antarctic scientific fairy tales, narrative retellings of climate data that preserve scientific accuracy while using story structure to make the information accessible and emotionally engaging. A tale about the ice shelves, personified and given voices, experiencing the warming that threatens their existence. A narrative about penguin colonies facing disrupted food chains. These aren't falsifications of data but translations into story, bridging the gap between research and public understanding. The narrative form bypasses the resistance many people feel towards scientific abstraction and statistical presentation, reaching emotional and intuitive understanding that can motivate concern and action. Educational resources have emerged that systematically integrate fairy tales with scientific exploration. Hands-on fairy tale science books pair 25 or more classic tales with experiments that test principles of physics, chemistry, and biology relevant to events in the stories. Each tale becomes a jumping-off point for investigation. The Three Little Pigs leads to experiments on material strength and structural engineering. Jack and the Beanstalk prompts exploration of plant growth and the limits of biological scaling. The Princess and the Pea investigates pressure distribution and sensory thresholds. These resources recognize that fairy tales are already part of children's mental landscape, familiar and engaging, and leverage that familiarity to introduce scientific concepts that might otherwise seem dry or intimidating. Beyond concrete scientific applications, fairy tales engage with deeper questions about how humans understand uncertainty and possibility. Some researchers exploring quantum cognition models, frameworks that apply principles from quantum physics to model human decision-making and belief, have found that fairy tales facilitate understanding of probability and uncertainty. The multiple possible outcomes in fairy tales, will the hero succeed or fail, will help come or not, mirror the multiple possible states in quantum superposition. The way fairy tale listeners hold multiple possibilities in mind simultaneously, maintaining uncertainty until the story resolves, parallels how quantum systems exist in superposition until measured. This doesn't mean fairy tales are teaching quantum physics, but they may be training cognitive flexibility about possibility and uncertainty that later supports understanding of probabilistic and quantum concepts. Neuroscience has revealed specific brain networks that fairy tales activate with particular strength. The default mode network, a set of brain regions that becomes active when we're not focused on external tasks, shows heightened activation during fairy tale engagement. This network is involved in mental simulation, imagining scenarios, thinking about the future, planning, considering alternatives. Fairy tales, with their vivid scenarios and consequential choices, exercise these capacities. When a child wonders what will happen next in a story, they're simulating possible futures. When they consider what a character should do, they're mentally testing alternative actions and outcomes. This simulation capacity, strengthened through story engagement, transfers to planning and decision-making in real life. The child becomes better at imagining future scenarios, anticipating consequences, preparing for possibilities. The formation of beliefs, the cognitive process by which we come to accept certain things as true, involves specific brain regions that show enhanced evolution in humans compared to other primates. Fairy tale processing engages the parietal cortex and medial frontal cortex, regions involved in abstract reasoning, evaluating evidence, integrating information, forming judgments about truth and plausibility. These are among the brain regions that show the most pronounced expansion in human evolution, suggesting their importance to our species' cognitive distinctiveness. Fairy tales, by presenting impossible scenarios that must be mentally evaluated, may exercise these belief formation systems. The listener must constantly make judgments about what's plausible within the story world, tracking internal consistency even while recognizing external impossibility. This sophisticated cognitive dance, accepting story logic while maintaining reality awareness, may have contributed to the evolution of our capacity for abstract reasoning and complex belief systems. The structure of fairy tale narratives is distinctive enough that machine learning algorithms can identify it with remarkable accuracy. Classifiers trained on narrative features can distinguish fairy tale genres from accounts of real events with 92% accuracy. The algorithms detect patterns in narrative markers, the presence of magical elements, archetypal character types, particular plot structures, formulaic openings and closings, emotional trajectories. These structural signatures mark fairy tales as a distinct genre, recognizable not just to human readers but to pattern recognition algorithms. This suggests that fairy tales really do have consistent structural properties that differentiate them from other forms of narrative, properties that emerge through cultural evolution and that serve specific psychological and social functions. The effects of fairy tales on listeners extend into physiology. Fairy tale rhythm, the pacing and cadence of oral storytelling, can entrain biological rhythms in listeners. Heart rate variability, the natural variation in time between heartbeats, is an important measure of autonomic nervous system function and overall health. Higher heart rate variability generally indicates better physiological regulation and stress resilience. Research has documented that the rhythms of fairy tale narration can synchronize with and improve heart rate variability in listeners. The story's pacing, its rises and falls, its patterns of tension and release, guide the listener's physiology into more regulated, healthier patterns. The body literally syncs to the story, and this synchronization promotes autonomic regulation, the healthy coordination of the systems that control breathing, heart rate, digestion, and stress response. In language education, fairy tales continue to prove their worth. Studies on French foreign language learning have documented that using fairy tales in the curriculum improves both language acquisition and social skills development. The familiar structures help students follow stories even when they don't understand every word, building confidence and comprehension strategies. The rich vocabulary and complex grammar provide language input at an appropriate level of challenge. The emotional engagement sustains motivation through the difficult work of learning a new language. And because fairy tales are often discussed in groups, analyzed collaboratively, and sometimes dramatized, they create opportunities for social interaction in the target language, building both linguistic and social competencies simultaneously. The students aren't just learning French vocabulary and grammar, they're learning to communicate, to collaborate, to understand and express complex ideas in a new language, all scaffolded by the familiar and engaging structure of fairy tales. So fairy tales bridge between the imaginative and the empirical, the ancient and the cutting edge, the biological and the cultural. They teach science by showing what science prohibits. They communicate data by wrapping it in narrative. They train cognitive capacities for simulation and planning. They exercise the brain systems that evolved for abstract reasoning and belief formation. Their structural signatures are distinctive enough for machines to recognize. Their rhythms can regulate human physiology. And they continue to support learning across domains, from foreign languages to scientific principles, from social skills to probabilistic thinking. These impossibly old stories about impossible events turn out to be remarkably practical tools, effective across an astonishing range of applications because they engage so many different aspects of human cognition, emotion, physiology, and social life simultaneously. They work because they speak multiple languages at once, the language of emotion and the language of structure, the language of the body and the language of culture, the language of individual psychology and the language of collective human experience refined over thousands of years of telling and retelling. When children encounter fairy tales told in two languages, moving fluidly between them in what linguists call bilingual retellings, something interesting happens to their language processing abilities. Code switching, the practice of alternating between languages within a conversation or even within a sentence, is a sophisticated linguistic skill that requires keeping both language systems active simultaneously and knowing when and how to move between them. Bilingual fairy tale retellings provide natural practice in code switching because the familiar story structure allows children to follow meaning even as the language alternates. They develop metalinguistic awareness, the ability to think consciously about language itself as a system. They notice patterns, contrasts between the languages, different ways of expressing the same idea. This awareness of language as an object of thought, not just a transparent medium of communication, supports deeper learning and greater linguistic flexibility. The child becomes not just a language user but a language observer, capable of reflecting on and manipulating linguistic structures consciously. We've circled back, in a way, to where we began, to the intimate space of family reading where parent and child share a story together. This simple ritual, repeated night after night, builds cognitive empathy, that capacity to understand another's perspective and internal experience. As the child follows characters through their journeys, imagining their thoughts and feelings, empathy systems activate and strengthen. But something else happens simultaneously. The shared experience, the physical closeness, the parent's voice speaking words that captivate the child's imagination, all of this strengthens attachment, the emotional bond that provides security and supports healthy development. The fairy tale is the content, but the context is connection, and both matter profoundly. In this moment, Cognitive growth and emotional bonding aren't separate processes but intertwined aspects of a single developmental experience. The behavioral effects extend beyond the reading moment into how children interact with others. Prosocial behavior, actions that benefit others like sharing, helping, cooperating, shows measurable enhancement following fairy tale exposure. The mechanism appears to be modeled reciprocity. The countless examples in fairy tales where kindness is returned, help is reciprocated, generosity leads to reward. Children internalize these patterns, not as abstract moral rules but as narrative templates for social interaction. They've seen through story after story that cooperation leads to better outcomes than selfishness, that helping others often means receiving help in return, that community and connection triumph over isolation. These narrative patterns become behavioral tendencies, shaping how children approach social situations. For adults struggling with self-acceptance or life satisfaction, positive narrative interventions using fairy tales have shown therapeutic value. Engaging with fairy tales in structured therapeutic contexts, discussing their meanings, relating them to personal experiences, recognizing oneself in archetypal patterns, this process leads to measurable increases in self-acceptance and life appreciation. Perhaps it's the recognition that one's own struggles mirror ancient patterns, that difficulty and transformation are universal human experiences. Perhaps it's the narrative structure itself, which shows that hardship can lead to growth, that darkness can give way to light. The fairy tales provide frameworks for reinterpreting personal narratives in more hopeful and self-compassionate ways. What felt like personal failure becomes recognizable as a stage in a larger journey. What seemed like meaningless suffering gains narrative coherence. Looking at the full scope of fairy tale influence, what becomes clear is their remarkable persistence and adaptability. They continue to inspire modern media, from films and television series to video games and virtual reality experiences. They inform therapeutic practices, from trauma therapy for children to narrative therapy for adults. They shape educational approaches across disciplines, from language learning to science education. This worldwide, cross-domain influence spanning millennia suggests we're dealing with something fundamental to human culture, not a passing fashion or arbitrary tradition but a form of cultural expression that answers to deep needs and serves crucial functions. The comparative phylogenetic analyses we discussed earlier, combined with evolutionary approaches from biology and anthropology, have revealed just how ancient and cross-cultural these roots truly are. Some fairy tales trace back thousands of years, predating writing, surviving through pure oral transmission across dozens or hundreds of generations. They spread with human migrations, diversified with cultural divergence, yet maintained recognizable core structures. This isn't how ephemeral entertainment behaves. This is how adaptive cultural information propagates, tested and refined by time, selected for attention because of genuine usefulness. The fairy tales that reached us today are survivors, winners of a cultural evolutionary process that spanned the full history of human civilization and reached back into prehistory. They remain central, not peripheral, to child development. Cognitive growth, the development of memory, attention, language, reasoning, imagination, all receive support from fairy tale engagement. Emotional literacy, the ability to recognize, understand, and communicate about feelings, develops through encounters with the rich emotional content of these stories. Moral reasoning, understanding right and wrong, consequence and responsibility, emerges through the ethical dilemmas and clear moral stakes that fairy tales present. These aren't separate benefits but interconnected aspects of development that fairy tales address simultaneously, making them remarkably efficient developmental tools. Fairy tales serve as bridges, connecting domains that often seem separate. They bridge imagination and learning, showing that fantasy and education aren't opposites but partners. They bridge individual psychology and culture, demonstrating how personal development happens through engagement with collective wisdom accumulated over generations. They bridge past and present, making ancient stories relevant to contemporary children. They bridge the conscious and unconscious, addressing psychological material that's too complex or threatening for direct discussion. They bridge the emotional and the cognitive, engaging feeling and thinking together rather than separately. What they reveal, ultimately, is the distinctiveness of human cognition itself. The capacity for narrative, for organizing experience into stories with characters, sequences, causes, meanings. This appears to be a fundamental feature of how human minds work. We don't just record information, we story it, embedding facts in narrative frameworks that make them memorable and meaningful. The capacity for symbolic thought, for understanding that one thing can represent another, that impossibilities in fiction can convey truths about reality, this too is quintessentially human. And creative problem-solving, the ability to imagine solutions that don't yet exist, to mentally simulate alternatives, to think beyond current constraints, this capacity that fairy tales both model and exercise may be humanity's most distinctive cognitive gift. The magic in fairy tales, when we step back and consider it, isn't really about the impossibility of the events. It's about what those impossible events reveal and develop in us. A pumpkin becoming a coach is impossible, but the human imagination that conceives this transformation, that delights in it, that uses it to think about change and possibility, that imagination is very real. Talking animals are impossible, but the human capacity to imagine other minds, to simulate consciousness different from our own, to use anthropomorphism as a tool for understanding, that capacity is not only real but essential to our social nature. Instant transformations violate biology, but the human desire for change, growth, transcendence, the belief that we can become more than we currently are, this is at the heart of human motivation and striving. So what seems magical in fairy tales is actually a mirror, reflecting back to us the remarkable properties of human cognition, culture, and curiosity. The stories are impossible, but they're impossible in ways that illuminate what's real and important about being human. They've persisted for thousands of years because they work, because they support development, because they transmit valuable information, because they create shared understanding, because they exercise crucial cognitive and emotional capacities. They've adapted to every medium from oral telling around fires to virtual reality simulations because the core patterns resonate with something fundamental in how human minds develop and function. They connect us to our ancestors who told versions of these same stories millennia ago, and they'll likely connect us to descendants who will still be telling them millennia hence, because the challenges of growing up human, of learning to think and feel and imagine and connect, these challenges are not historical accidents but permanent features of the human condition. And fairy tales, these impossible, ancient, ever-new stories, remain among our best tools for navigating them.